Okay, so in this video we're looking at the history of rugby league in the United States. Now, I've done a video on the history of rugby league in France. We've also done a video looking at the possibility of the United States ever hosting a Rugby League World Cup, which could do massive wonders for growing the game internationally and growing the player base and the fan base. The history of rugby league in the US goes back to 1939. Now, this is just before World War II. The Californian Rugby Football Union wrote to the RFL stating an intent to switch codes from rugby union to rugby league. By June of that year, the RFL is planning a delegation to be assembled to go to the US and sit down and discuss with the California Rugby Football Union how best to establish clubs and player base, and World War II breaks out a few months after that. So all plans are put on hold and they are shelved. After the war, obviously, Reconstruction in Europe happens. The French resume playing rugby league and get to host the 1954 World Cup. The year before, however, in 1953, a man called Mike Dimitro, who was an ex-American football player and wrestler, organised an American All-Stars tour of Australia and New Zealand, which they played 22 matches. They won 6 and drew 2. Bearing in mind, none of the players had actually played the sport prior to the tour. All were American football players by trade. At some point, be it collegiately, high school, or in the various professional leagues like the American Football League and the NFL. None of them had played rugby league or even rugby union before. They managed to win 6 matches on a tour of Australia and New Zealand. Let that sink in. 1954, they decided to tour France following the World Cup, and they lost 31-0 against France in Paris in a tour match. Australia and New Zealand, following that World Cup, decided to tour the US. So, international teams of high quality, the American fans and players are coming into contact with. By the 1960s, the US decided to put several attempts at hosting a Rugby League World Cup. So, when any World Cup is first set up, it's always in its infancy. It may not take off. And in Rugby League's case, it was in its infancy at this point of how they organised and structured it. And they failed throughout the 60s to get the World Cup in Rugby League, but they made multiple attempts in that decade to be a host nation of a World Cup, because they saw what happened in 1954 with France and how the French public responded to the younger code compared to union, and their biggest rugby football union in California wanted to switch codes only 20-30 years before, so attempts were made. It's the 70s, in the late 70s, where Mike Meyer sets up the United States Rugby League and attempts to gain investment from the UK and Australia, but all attempts in a 2-year period between 76 and 78 really failed to get off the ground, but the attempt is there. The intent is there. 1986, so we have to go through another decade. The Tri-Counties Rugby League is established with 4 teams. 3 teams are Canadian and only 1 team is from the USA. 1987 is a pivotal moment. I've mentioned this before, so if you've watched any of my live streams, I've mentioned this before, and obviously as an NRL fan, the NRL is planning to possibly at some point, either this year or next year at the earliest, take games to the US. State of origin, however, New South Wales and Queensland did that in 1987 following their 3-match series, which is always state of origin, is always 3 matches. They played a 4th exhibition match in Long Beach. Now, sources differ on the amount of spectators. The lower end says 7,000, the higher end says 10,000, and the Australians at this time say it was a success. Those who were looking at the finances and was it profitable or not and successful say it was a failure. It was a one-off exhibition match. But that same year, the first official test match from the US is played against Canada. Now, Canada had a bit more of establishment, playing both union and league at this point, more established nation. And that's their first ever test match was played versus Canada. The following year, the Wigan Warriors and Warrington Wolves play an exhibition match in Milwaukee at the County Stadium. Wigan won 12-5 on the day. The attendance was 17,773. So the attendance is double, an approximation of what the New South Wales and Queensland teams did the year prior in Long Beach. Early 90s. So the Super League war in Australia is brewing, and the switch in England from the old Rugby League Championship competition to the Super League is also brewing. So changes are afoot in the traditional locations. But in 1991, Rugby World TV promoter John F. Morgan contacted Rugby League Australia about sending a team to the Sydney Sevens. Now, the Sydney Sevens is like a forerunner to the like what we would later know as the Auckland Nine. So it's the shorter format of the game. It's basically your outside backs and mobile loose forwards, your skilled players basically. And he's contacted by the Australians, because he has his own TV channel, Rugby World TV, about organising a team. His team that he organises in 1993 to enter that competition of the Sydney Sevens is called the American Patriots. Between 91 and 95 as well, just prior to the Super League War, Rugby World TV secures rights to the Australian ARL competitions. So that'd be your 7s, your 9s, 10s, and obviously your 13-a-sides New South Wales Rugby League, which became obviously the ARL. This is at the time of massive upheaval in the game in Australia, called the Super League Wars, which we've covered on the channel at great length, which ultimately in 1998 led to the establishment of the NRL following the Super League and ARL competitions fighting each other for players, clubs, fans and funding. So to secure overseas TV rights at a great time of upheaval was a big thing. There's eyes on the product in a new market. At this same time, a former Australian player, David New, becomes involved in growing the sport. He becomes part of the governing body. He works alongside John F. Morgan in promoting the game and growing the game in a variety of areas. He's also a school teacher in Philadelphia at the time, so he's a PE teacher at the time as well, and he gets involved with John F. Morgan. A lot of things happen after 92. So by 96, matches versus Canada and Russia are played in San Francisco. So again, that West Coast involvement, we see dating back to 1939, the California Rugby Football Union wanting to play league. We've seen the State of Origin exhibition match. We've seen all these things happen. And again, that West Coast involvement is there. 96 and 97, the US team competes in the Super League World Nines. This is at the time the height of the Super League Wars. The Super League America is set up in 97. It's a 6-team league officially set up in 98. 2000, 2003 and 2004, the US team, national side, plays at the Emerging Nations Cup and the Victory Cup in those competitions. In also 2000, the headquarters of the Super League America moves to Jacksonville in Florida and is renamed US Rugby League. They failed to qualify at the same time for the 2000 World Cup, which is important. There's also a dispute with the Rugby Football League here in the UK, which led to financial issues and instability, which led to the renaming as USA Rugby League. 2001 rolls along, so the new millennium is now upon us. 5 teams announce a formation of the American National Rugby League. In 2002, it expands to 6 teams. By 2003, it's expanded to 8 teams. By 2006, 3 more teams join, so that's 11 in total at that point. In 2007, a 12th team joins the league. 2009, a 13th team joins the league. Now, by 2010, 1 team suspends operations and 1 team joins. Technically, there's 14 teams, although 13 are active. Now, the National Rugby League USA is set up as a rival to this National Rugby League in America in 2009 to start play in 2010. And this leads to a split in the semi-pro ranks on the east coast of the US and ultimately in Canada as well, in what league you want to play in. 7 teams leave the American National Rugby League and go into and set up the USA Rugby League. 2 new teams join that. At the same time, there's the creation of the American Youth Rugby League Association. 2012 rolls around and the AMNRL partners with the Grand Prix Rugby in preparation for the 2013 World Cup, which the US qualify for. They also qualify for the 2017 World Cup. In between those 2 World Cups in 2016, and this is really, really interesting, they were awarded the 2025 World Cup with Canada. 2 years later, this is before the Toronto Wolfpack has failed in 2020, before the Oswald Races are relocated back to Cornwall via Hemel Hempstead, where they started off as the Hemel Hempstead Stags, before going over to Canada to never play a game because of the pandemic. The US and Canada, who were meant to be co-hosts of the next World Cup in 2025, considering we just had the delayed 2021 World Cup last autumn, or fall if you're American, they're stripped of the hosting rights. And this doesn't really make international news. It's not a major thing. It doesn't really blow up the news waves. But this is very, very important. They were actually going to host a World Cup in 2025. So when I've been discussing will the US ever host a Rugby League World Cup, they were planning to. But for some reason, there were concerns about the infrastructure, what stadiums they were going to use, the locations, a whole host of issues, which ultimately led to France being awarded that 2025 World Cup. Now, France hosted the first ever World Cup in 1954. So we've gone full circle here. That same year they are stripped of the World Cup. New Zealand played England at Mile High Stadium in Denver in front of nearly 20,000 people. The actual attendance was 19,320. So they're getting actually decent crowds for exhibition matches and internationals throughout the history. And those crowds are getting bigger each time. Now, that is the biggest ever crowd at a rugby league match ever in the US in its history since 1939. Currently, as things currently stand, there are 14 clubs registered and 700 registered players. They obviously failed to qualify for the delayed 2021 World Cup, which is frustrating, and they don't play enough regular rugby league internationals to improve the quality of the game. Now, there have been various plans in more recent times to get a professional league off the ground, predominantly on the East Coast. But there seems to be, especially in the last 20 years, the sport itself seems to be fighting itself. There is no unified, real, strong governing body. There seems to be no idea how to attract funding. Yet the sport itself, when matches are brought over, do attract people to watch. Now, rugby league, okay, it isn't rugby union for its global appeal. It doesn't have the international punching power of rugby union. So when the Rugby Union World Cup gets played later this year, the crowds will be fantastic. They will be fantastic. There is no doubt on that. However, to get nearly 20,000 at a Rugby League international outside of Australia or New Zealand or even England and to a certain extent France, in a country that's is not a traditional market for it, that's not bad going. And that was only 5 years ago. That's not bad. That is not bad, and that is in NFL country. That is in the Denver Broncos, who won. This is a team that's played in Super Bowls. That's a fantastic facility. To get 20,000 people, yes, there's a lot of empty seats, but 20,000 eyes, near enough, on two of the best international teams in the world speaks volumes. Bearing in mind, just over 34 years ago, hey, they got just under that number with just under 18,000 in Milwaukee for a club exhibition match between Wigan and Warrington, two of the most historical. Wigan, probably the most successful rugby league side of all time, and the Warrington Wolves in more recent times have been quite successful in Milwaukee. It was a low-scoring game. It's an exhibition match, but those figures are pretty good. The state of origin experiment, okay, we can debate the pros and cons of that. But with the NRL considering very strongly to take matches to the US, as I said in the previous video, will the US ever host a Rugby League World Cup? But the NRL seriously considering taking pre-season or regular season games to the US at some point. They've obviously looked at the viewership figures during lockdown and during the pandemic in 2020, when the NRL started up before any North American league did, and realised there is an appetite for the product. So we shall see what happens going forward, but there is a brief history of rugby league in the United States. It's a very complex history as time goes on through the 90s onwards, but the attempts to get a World Cup are back in the 60s, first off, and very, very quickly, just before World War II, there's an intent to play the game. Imagine if World War II doesn't happen, that the history could be a lot different to what it is today. And of course, they play tour matches with no experience in 53, and out of 22 games, win 6 of them. In Australia and New Zealand, where, hey, that's some of the best players in the world, even then, were playing rugby league down under. With no experience at all, they formed a team, played. So they were brave pioneers in the 50s, and the various attempts, yes, there's funding issues, there's sponsorship issues, they've got to compete against the NFL, they've got to compete against the NHL, the big contact sports, and they've got to compete with the big networks not really interested. But since the 90s, it's been a really mishmash. The attempts were there in the from the 50s through to the 80s, but the 90s onwards has been all over the place. They've tried rapid expansion. They did get awarded a World Cup. They've lost a World Cup. So what happens in the future? Time will tell. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please place your thoughts in the comments section below, and I'll have some more content for you very, very soon.